There once was a young girl who had been in a terrible accident. A water demon had come to reside in her village, and the river near her home had flooded well beyond its banks. As she played in the river one day, she nearly drowned. Her lungs never fully recovered from the accident. They ached, and her body often sickened. And her spirit never fully recovered either. She grew terrified of the water and refused to play in anything any larger than a puddle. One day, as she lay very ill in bed, her brother sat beside her bedside and told her stories. Stories of brave heroes going on grand adventures to save their loved ones from monsters. The stories were like medicine to her. They inspired her and gave her the strength to get better. And so she survived. Before long, the young girl had grown into a young woman, and then the demon returned. The demon had also grown, and its destructive power grew with it. The river swelled well beyond its banks, washing away crops and even homes. Mosquitoes swarmed like a cloud, biting people and making them terribly ill. Sickness and starvation spread throughout the village. The village elders consulted the village wise man about what to do. And the wise man said, "Someone must go to collect the eternal flame and bring it here. The flame will frighten the demon away. As soon as that water demon gets one look at the flame's light, it will leave this village in peace." And the village elders called all the people together and asked for a volunteer to go and get the eternal flame and bring it back to the village. And the young woman thought about her brother's stories, about the brave heroes who went on grand adventures and saved their loved ones from monsters. She raised her hand. "I'll go." Her brother pulled her aside. "Are you sure?" he asked. "The journey will be long and hard, and your lungs have always given you pain, and you're terrified of the water. You will have to cross a great river in order to reach the eternal flame. Are you sure this is something that you want to do?" The young woman thought seriously about his concerns. It was true that her lungs pained her, and she was so afraid of the water. But the idea of her brother and the other villagers starving or sickening filled her with even more pain and terrified her even more than the river. She didn't want anybody to go through what she had suffered. She'd do anything to protect them. "I want to go," she said. The journey was indeed long and hard, but as she journeyed, she told herself her brother's stories and thought about all the people back home who were depending on her. And before long, she crossed the wilderness and came upon a raging river. On the other side of the river, she could see a flickering flame upon a stone. The eternal flame. Her journey was almost over. But there was no way across the river. The water was too deep and swift-moving for her to move across, and there was no bridge, no boat. There was just a small hut next to the river where the guardian of the eternal flame kept watch. The woman approached the hut, and she knocked on the door. And when the guardian asked her, "What do you want?" she said, "How might I cross the river?" And the guardian looked at her and looked at the river, looked at the eternal flame and back at her and said, "I can get you across the river, but it will cost you." "Not money," the guardian added as she began to reach into her purse. "Something deeper and more personal, a part of yourself." And the young woman thought about this strange request, a part of herself, like a leg or her hair. And then she smiled because she had an idea. She'd give the guardian a part of herself, all right. She'd give over a part of herself that she least wanted to keep. "Take my pain and my fear," she said. "I give them to you freely." The guardian did what she asked. And as the guardian lifted the pain and fear up and away from her, the young woman felt light. So light, in fact, that she floated up off the ground and into the air, and a gentle breeze came and pushed her across the river. And soon she landed softly on the other side, right next to the eternal flame. The young woman looked at the eternal flame in confusion. Now that she was here, she couldn't quite see what the big deal was. Sure, she remembered the plight of her village, but she couldn't bring herself to care. She knew that people were sick and starving, but the thought filled her with no pain, no fear. She had left all of her pain and her fear on the riverbank with the guardian. The young woman stared at the eternal flame for a moment, and then she turned her back and she walked away. Next week, I'm going to be preaching on the soul, more specifically on what I and other Unitarian Universalist ministers mean when we often throw that term around without explanation. Today, I'm here to tell you that one of the most surefire ways to kill the human soul is to label a part of it as weak. Our society doesn't have a whole lot of tolerance for weakness. In fact, our society seems to have some kind of strange allergy to weakness. One tiny little whiff of weakness, of vulnerability or flaws, and we try to purge the weakness from our midst. Just think about how we treat people that we believe to be weak, how we treat the homeless, how we treat the poor. Like the body's immune system reacting to the presence of a harmful allergen, our society reacts to weakness by trying to get rid of it as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And because our society is hyper-vigilant in guarding itself against weakness, it sometimes is a bit over-hasty in identifying things as weakness that really aren't. Things that in reality are vitally needed in a healthy, well-functioning community. The story that I shared a moment ago, in the story, the young woman saw her pain and fear as nothing but flaws. She had something important to accomplish, and she thought that these were weaknesses that held her back. And so when given the opportunity, she purged herself of them. She got rid of a couple of parts of herself that she considered to be weaknesses, and in doing so, she lost herself. She lost her purpose. Now, I'm not here to argue today that there is no such thing as weakness. Quite the opposite. In fact, there are things that make us as individuals and as a society weaker. Nor am I here to argue that we should not appropriately address our weaknesses, personal or collective. For example, pain, whether it is physical or emotional, must be alleviated. We should not force ourselves or others to endure unnecessary suffering. Unaddressed pain can indeed weaken us and hold us back from living full lives. And the knowledge of that is part of why we work for justice. But at the same time, we need to be capable of experiencing pain. Our capacity to feel pain is an essential part of our ability to empathize with the pain of others. You cannot empathize with the pain of others if you have never felt pain yourself. Our deep personal knowledge of pain helps us respond to the suffering of others with compassion. And similarly, fear can be a weakness, but it doesn't have to be. Inadequately addressed fear can hinder us. When the fight or flight reflex kicks in response to something that doesn't truly threaten our physical or emotional well-being, it can be rather maladaptive. It can cause us to avoid taking the kinds of risks that help us to grow into better selves, personally and collectively. Or it can cause us to try to attack and destroy things, and sometimes even people, that frighten us, even when they're not truly threats to us in any way. And yet we do need to be able to feel fear. A healthy dose of fear when our well-being is truly threatened can protect us, and sometimes is what saves our lives. And when we're concerned about the well-being of others, when we recognize that others are in danger, then we may actually be inspired to do what we can to protect them from harm. Fear plays a role in our lives and our ability to make a better world. And so when we lose our capacity for pain and fear, when we become disconnected from our own ability to feel concern for the well-being of those around us, we leave the world just a little bit of a crappier place than it was before. And the world itself is already not all rainbows and roses. The world of human interaction can at times be brutal. Ours is a society that worships a rather messed up notion of strength. Strength measured by the number of guns our citizens tote. Strength measured by the number of bombs our nation is capable of lobbing around. Strength measured by the capacity of one human being to exert their will over countless others, or one group to exert their will over others. Strength measured by our capacity to disconnect from our emotions, to be strong. Strength measured by our contempt for the vulnerable. Strength measured by our ability to amass wealth, influence, and power over others. This twisted understanding of strength shows up in our lives in all kinds of ways. For example, often as I officiate memorial services, working with grieving families, I hear people apologize to me, their minister, for their tears, and talk about how they need to be strong. They know they need to be strong. The idea that grief is weakness is so deeply ingrained in our strength-worshiping society. Emotion is seen as weakness. But grief isn't weakness. The world needs people who are capable of grieving, because grief points to our capacity for great strength. Real strength, the ability to connect with other human beings, the capacity to love someone, the ability to care about someone, or in some cases, something deeply, so deeply that when that person or that thing is hurt or is ripped away from us, our very souls bleed for a time. No, grief is not weakness. The capacity to care that deeply is not weakness. In the reading that Ivy shared with us earlier, we were reminded that, as the more traditional language goes, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That quote comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus delivered that sermon, he wasn't actually trying to get people into some kind of afterlife. He was trying to get them into heaven on earth. He was trying to teach people a better way to live their lives in this life, to teach people how to create a radically different kind of society than the one they knew, and quite frankly, than the one we know. A society grounded not in violence and exploitation, but a different kind of understanding of strength. A society grounded in love. He stood before his followers, people who were living under the harsh conditions of Roman occupation, and told them that a new world was at hand. Things in the new world order were going to be flipped on their head because it was to be a drastically different kind of society, founded on drastically different kinds of principles. In that new society, things that had been erroneously condemned as weak were going to become sources of strength. No longer would those who waged war, who got what they wanted through force, who maintained systems of power and privilege through the constant threat of violence, be regarded as the strong. Might would no longer make right. No, those who worked for peace, who sought compromise and cooperation and dedicated themselves to resolving conflicts in ways that benefited everybody involved, they would be regarded as the exemplars. They would be called the children of God. No longer would the arrogant, egotistical, the puffed up self-important, the overconfident be in charge. Now the humble, those who knew and weren't afraid to admit their limitations, those who were willing to ask for help from experts, those people would guide society as leaders. No longer would harshness and cruelty be seen as strength. Now gentleness, kindness, and mercy would be given their rightful place. Love would be seen as a source of power to guide everyone in living in a better society. So it isn't really all that surprising, I think, that people often spiritualize Jesus' teachings by arguing that he was talking about an afterlife instead of talking about our lives here on earth, because that maybe requires an inward change, not an outward change in the way we live our lives with one another. The kind of community he describes may seem so incredibly foreign to our experiences that it sounds like a fantasy, like something that is not possible in the real world, and so has to be tucked away in an afterlife. After all, despite the fact that nearly 2,000 years or more than 2,000 years have passed since he delivered his Sermon on the Mount, in a lot of the ways, things really haven't changed. We still live in a society that equates strength with the ability to exert power over others or to harm others. And yet I firmly believe that another kind of community is possible. The world doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. We can free ourselves from this mess and live in a better world if we tap into our true sources of strength and grow them together. If we tap into the well springs of courage and power that will help us build a different kind of community from the inside out. And it starts with love. Love sometimes gets a surprisingly bad rap among those of us who are working for change. I remember an argument I had with another activist years ago about whether or not love could truly be something that could help transform unjust institutions, and he scoffed at the idea. He said that what we need is power, not some flimsy feeling. I remember that phrase, a flimsy feeling. He thought love was too weak to be truly effective as a force for good in the world. But love is not some flimsy, touchy-feely emotion. Love is an orientation toward others and toward the world. Love shapes the very way that we interact with other human beings. It shapes how we respond to life itself. And love has a shape of its own, and that shape is justice. As Cornel West once said, justice is what love looks like in public. Love rights unjust power imbalances. Love dismantles system of power and privilege and does the hard work of bringing people back into right relationship with one another, into respectful, healthy, and equal relationship. Love organizes society to ensure that everyone's needs are met, that all flourish, not just the powerful, not those who have the access to the means to look out for their own needs. Love is like an acorn. When we have love deep inside us, when it is at the center of our being, of our souls, when all the things that we do grow out of love, then amazing things are possible. Our capacity to connect, to care, grows. Our self-interest diminishes as we recognize needs beyond our own and extend care to others. Our generosity grows, and as others are enriched, so too are we. For we are each stronger when we are all stronger. May we recognize and reclaim new sources of personal and collective strength, love, empathy, concern for others, gentleness, kindness, generosity, peace. Don't be afraid to be labeled a snowflake or a bleeding heart liberal. May we use these principles to help us build a new world, a new way together. May it be so. And now, please rise in body or spirit and join me in singing our closing hymn, Building a New Way, 1017 in your teal hymnal.